Well, hello, and it's been a little while, but we have the two grumpy old men here. No, I'm joking. We have Chris Robershaw, who's, to be fair, you said, come on, let's do something. And I went, okay. You can see it's slightly different setup. I'm in a transit mode and I've been doing some other stuff. But nice to have you here, Chris. There's certainly been so many things going on. I mean,
well, absolutely.
I mean, I kind of got cancelled myself at one stage by the government, so I kind of understand how these things now work. But I hope people still have an interest, because that's the trouble. We're going to talk about the COVID review, the independent review of government management into the Ranson case, right? Mm-hmm. That was back with Richard Wright KC on the end of January.
Indeed.
But isn't it interesting that people have almost, I felt it's like World War II almost to some people. It was like, let's don't talk about it anymore. Let's park this one. It's getting a bit annoying almost.
Well, you can understand that viewpoint, and I think to some extent we all share it. But this review this morning of this report isn't based on the principle that we want the listener to return back to the COVID issue. Mm. If you remember, you and I did a tremendous amount of work on the Rosalind Ranson case, but right the way through it, and I think you'd have to go back and re-listen to some of them, I kept referring to the fact that at the core of the problem, I believed, was the Attorney General's office.
You made that very clear.
Well, the point is that this independent report arrives at the same conclusion. But then, having arrived at it, it then ends up very, very weakly at the end. Weak as in W-E-A-K, not week, fortnight. And it leaves, I think it leaves Tynwald with the position that, well, what do we do now? So it identifies some very clear issues, and then in summary produces a very weak observation. Some of his final observations are inaccurate, and we'll definitely cover those, I hope. And in the end, we've got a position now where this report came out in January, and I haven't really heard anybody talk about it in Tynwald. And if you recall, the Chief Minister, as it were, invited Tynwald to pick this issue up of how was Rosalind Ranson treated. A committee was formed. The committee then employed Richard Wright KC. He produced his report, and from that point on, it's sort of gone quiet.
And no one's blamed for anything in that sense, isn't it?
Well, I was very concerned about how this report pans out in the end and where it might take us. And I happened to bump into one of the committee who appointed Richard Wright, and I expressed in no uncertain terms my concerns about the report, and it was almost a question of that member, and I won't name that person, just shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, you've gone too deep, in my view. His view was I was looking at it in too much of a deep sense. Well, of course, we've got a real problem on the Isle of Man with the Attorney General's office, and we have got to go deep to try and resolve these issues. And I hope I can, in our discussion this morning, can make my points clearly enough for people to understand what I'm trying to say.
I think we've got like 3 sections, so let's try to get going. What do you want to start with?
Well, the first one I'd like to discuss is the efforts or lack of them prior to going to litigation through the tribunal and through the appeals to try and resolve this with Rosalind Ranson so it didn't have to end up where it ended up. And in fact, Richard Wright, in paragraph 82 of his report and 83, and if with your agreement I'll read these, they're very short, he identifies this issue and he says, given the course of the remainder, this is paragraph 82 for those interested, given the course of the remainder of the litigation, this appears to me to have been the first example of the DHSC failing to grasp the potential impact of this case, financially and reputationally, and to give it the urgent attention that it deserved. This was also, in my view, an obvious opportunity to actively pursue early pragmatic resolution of the claim. Resolution at this stage may still have required a significant financial settlement, but would have obviated the need for protracted litigation. And in his next paragraph he says, ultimately, the parties may not have been able to come to terms, but the opportunity to do so should have been better explored. This was litigation that not only devastated the reputation of the DHSC, but also had a devastating impact upon many dedicated public servants who, as the litigation developed, found themselves being placed under intolerable pressure and subjected to extensive public scrutiny. I think those paragraphs are perfectly reasonable. Then extraordinarily, towards the end of the report, and here I draw the attention of those interested enough to paragraph 468, he says this: as a general observation, I am satisfied that at all times, the DHSC and its lawyers were open to a sensible negotiated settlement if one had proved possible. It may be that the proceedings had become so personal and entrenched that no such settlement was ever in prospect. Now, I don't know who misled Richard Wright KC here, but that was not the situation. You will recall that we both of us followed this case right the way through from, in my case, right from the very beginning and prior to this case when I became concerned about Abbotswood. And it was very, very clear to me, very clear, explicitly clear, and I'd be happy to explain this to a committee of Tynwald if they ever wanted to ask me, that there was no intention whatsoever on the part of government to try to enter into a sensible negotiated settlement prior to litigation. So I don't know where he's got this. I think they've lied to the KC.
Well, I thought they had said things in the past. They had tried or they'd done their best to do something.
No, they didn't.
But behind closed doors, we don't know what exactly went on, do we? Behind the scenes. There's always that potential that there was...
I do, to some extent I do.
You do, okay.
And I'm absolutely satisfied that is not a true statement of the situation. So right at the very beginning, that opportunity was there. I know that the other party was perfectly willing to enter into a sensible negotiation, and that was never made possible by government. Where does this come from, Paul? And here we come back to the mindset and culture of the Attorney General's office. There's an absolute arrogance on the part of the Attorney General's department and how it conducts itself. And you have to ask yourself, why is that the case? And it's the case because the Attorney General's office advises, I presume because it's a Crown appointment, will advise the Lieutenant General, the Lieutenant Governor, certainly will advise the Chief Minister, certainly advises the Council of Ministers, sits in with the Council of Ministers, sits in Tynwald and advises all the members and advises all the departments. If you have this total control over the situation that the Attorney General's office has, it's somewhat inevitable that we eventually find ourselves in a point where they become arrogant and think that they can, as it were, win every situation because that's their will and purpose.
Well, they were found wanting, weren't they? Numerous times. I mean, just...
Well, we'll discuss the fails in part two of because there's an enormous number.
Keep going.
An enormous number of them. Now, this became clear to me round about this problem, this fundamental problem with the Attorney General's office, around about, I think it was around about 2014. And myself and one or two other members recognised the fact that there needed to be an accountability with regard to the Attorney General's office, which does not exist, and secondly, with regard to issues of this nature and many more besides, that there needed to be an opportunity for members of Tynwald to hear other views. I've sat in Tynwald many times and I've heard members say, but what does the learned attorney think? And on many occasions I cringed because we haven't heard any other opinion. Now you and I know, and it's a famous phrase, isn't it, that there's as many legal opinions as there are lawyers. So how is it that government has placed itself in this ridiculous position where it has this absolutely narrow focus and total control on the part of one person, effectively?
Nothing has changed. When you were in Tynwald, this is exactly the same mechanism that was in place, right?
Yes, it was. And what we tried to do to change it was we said, look, we need alternative opinion. Let's just step back from this for a second. Politics works because you get a group of people coming together with different opinions, and they have to find a way of arriving at a consensus. That's how politics works. The judiciary works in exactly the same way because you have prosecution and defence, and you hear both arguments, and from that you then, as it were, ascribe a judgment through a jury, normally through a jury. So you need those alternative opinions in whatever sphere you're in if you're ever going to make good decisions. And yet, with regard to the government's legal advisory service, it's one place, one sole opportunity, and that's it.
Well, are they stretched too much? There's quite a lot of people working in the AGs now. Right? It's increased over the years quite a lot.
75, and yet this report says we need to. They
need more.
They failed, and to make it work, they need more money.
Right.
Ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And members of Tynwald have got to completely reject that. They really must. But what we tried to do about it, 2014, 2015, we said, look, there needs to be an opportunity for members to hear other legal opinions, and that needs to be completely independent from the AG's department. And we said we need a Solicitor General. So it was sort of accepted. Yes, well, perhaps we do need a Solicitor General. Yes, and so progress was made, only to find that when the role of Solicitor General appeared, it was actually the direct deputy to the Attorney General, and was one and together with the two of them became the Attorney General's office. So nothing was achieved at all. That role, the argument then was, well, we had to put it there because the Attorney General's got so much to do. Not only does that department advise all the areas that I've just described, but it's also in charge of the prosecution service. It's also in charge of overseeing major contracts. It's completely in control, but, and here is the nub of it, the issue is that when the Attorney General's office acts now in a sense of arrogance and control, they also know that if anybody wants to ever challenge them, it's a very expensive process for that individual or group to embark on. And so the name of the game thereafter is for the Attorney General's office to stretch it out as much as possible, to create as many trip points as they can, to, as it were, to wear the opposition, if you like, out, either through time or through money. And isn't that exactly what they tried to do with Rosalind Ranson? Exactly. Rosalind Ranson isn't an exception, except for one point. Rosalind Ranson had the courage, the determination, a barrister husband, and ultimately the backing of the BMA to keep going. Now, and what was the result? Failure on the part of the AG. Major failure.
Well, this was a shock to them, don't forget, probably, I should imagine, because they'd never had this situation before. Normally they could put a tape over your mouth, send you down the road with a bit of money maybe.
Precisely.
And that was it. The problem went away.
Totally unaccountable, totally arrogant, totally dominant in its position, knowing the control it had. It is up to Tynwald to stop this, to find a way forward.
What is the way forward?
Well, we'll deal with that in part 3 if we
Okay. I like him coming here and he just has it all sorted out. What else you want in this section? What else you got to lift and flag for us?
I think we've dealt with that really.
Oh, okay. So, well, let me ask you a few questions. I mean, again, back to when you were in the House of Keys and all this, and you could see what was going on. But nothing has changed then. I mean, did you actually put pressure yourself on at the time, or was that just the way it is?
No, we did. We said, look, we said this is the problem. This is what we need.
But you didn't get the answer you wanted, did you? You didn't get the result.
No. I mean,
I'm saying
we were nodded to, and people.
That's my point. I mean, is it almost like they just nod to you
and then ignored us?
Right.
Absolutely. And
that's what I was trying to get to. So what is the way around that?
Well,
these MH cases
well, I became so concerned after that I then asked Tynwald to set up a Constitutional, Legal and Justice Committee, because it felt to me that the membership of Tynwald was completely removed from this body, the Attorney General's office, that they lauded it as being the font of all knowledge, And it was undermining Tynwald, which is the senior court in the Isle of Man. And so,
I mean, this sounds worrying, right? To anybody that's listening to this.
It's hugely worrying.
It's a department that's out of control in that sense.
Yeah, look at the damage. Look at the damage that the Attorney General's office has delivered on the Isle of Man in this instance here. Now, I haven't heard a dicky bird from anybody in Tynwald so far with regard to this report and its weaknesses and what needs to be done. And I'll take you back to the point that I made with that member of the committee that appointed Richard Wright. Not really interested, and it worries the hell out of me because this matter has got to be resolved. It really must.
I mean, you may want to talk this elsewhere, but as this thing went on, then they got the private lawyers in because they themselves felt that they'd crossed such a point that they could not do much more, could they?
No, they were conflicted.
Conflicted then.
Yeah, so they had to. But
it was getting to the point when it was not making much sense anyway, was it?
Well, we don't really want to go too far down this in this section, but all I would say in answer to that point is an external Kennel Wild, there's no secret in that at all, were appointed, and the advice they gave the Attorney General's office over the paragraph 33 appeal was don't do it, don't go there. And what did the AG's department do? They went there and made a complete fool of themselves in the High Court in front of Deemster 1.
Okay, that's when they said, we don't know why we're here. Wasn't that
That's
sort of
it, yes.
Because we all sat there with our mouths open going, well, if you don't know why you're not here. Anyway, pause there. What's in part 2?
Part 2 is the failures of the Attorney General's office.
Okay, there's more.